just a few seconds. And thank you again.
Probably get more light if I do this direction.
Yeah, this direction is better.
Yeah,
Better. Thank you.
welcome.
So, um, we are live, and let me do a quick introduction on what's going on here for the audience. And, добрый день, друзья. Меня снова зовут Илья, и мы с вами сегодня встречаемся с Аланом Мейерсоном, потрясающим звукоинженером, известным по работе с огромным количеством картин. Я призываю вас писать вопросы в чат. Если что, в чате есть Сергей, который ответит, пришлет ссылочки на что-то, что мы обсуждаем. И чуть позже появятся субтитры с русским языком в том числе. Больше не могу говорить по-русски, предлагаю начать говорить по-английски. Hello, Alan.
Hello.
Thank you very much for joining us today in these strange and weird times. We're
Yes.
really happy to have you here.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and I hope everyone is being safe and careful and wearing their masks and gloves and just taking care during this crazy time.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy for all of us, and I hope you're healthy and your friends and family are fine.
So far, so good. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of questions from various people, and these questions aren't like categorized, so they would vary from the psychological aspects to technical stuff and so on. So please
Bring it on.
Yeah. So the first question is actually it came from my wife. Being an experienced engineer and you have so many releases and works behind in your catalog. Do you sometimes feel nervous about an upcoming release and upcoming movie, or it's already like you feel calm all the time when you have something big coming?
I feel a little nervous for all of them, actually. I always, it's funny. I'm of the type of personality that needs the constant reassurance that I actually do know what I'm doing. I don't look backwards and go, well, I've done all of this, so obviously I know what I'm doing. I'm always looking forwards and going, well, I hope I'm going to be able to do a good job on this one coming up. And, and I don't really, although I rely on my experience a lot, I don't try to limit myself by my experience. So every single time I work on a project, I'm trying to find something for that project in particular. And I'm always worried that that might not work. And at times that doesn't work. So, and then there are different clients that there are different kinds of demanding. They all expect sort of a perfection at this level, and I hope I deliver that. But some are demanding in a way that is more challenging. You have clients that will look at every single aspect of what you're doing. They'll look over your shoulder. They'll look at where you put the microphones, and they'll look at how you're EQing the violins or the drum kit, and ask you questions and question the timing and all that. And that can be very difficult and overwhelming. But then you have clients who just listen and go, that sounds great. Can we just have more emotion in this section? And you just have to calibrate the way you work to that. But I don't take it for granted. I'm very grateful for being able to work on great projects. So every single time I go in, I have a little bit of butterflies in my stomach, an American expression for nervousness.
Yeah, thank you very much. Next question from Pavlo Shevchuk, who is a brilliant engineer and music producer from Moscow. He's asking, could you please ask Alan about using Dolby Atmos? How deep does he use it, and do you use Atmos only as special effects, or how you use Dolby Atmos while mixing scores?
Yeah. Hi, Pablo. Great question. I have my main room as an Atmos room, and it's an ongoing. Since I've been mixing in Atmos and for Atmos for maybe 2 or 3 years now, and installed my Atmos room last year, so that, I mean, for a while I was mixing without really being able to hear it in Atmos until I went to the stage. But now I can, and I don't use it for effects really. What I try to do is just create the environment inside of the mix, and so the Atmos is used for microphones and stuff. I have to get myself off the screen here. I don't want to see myself. There we go. So the Atmos is really meant to expand my environment so that when you're sitting there listening to the orchestra or listening to the mix, you feel like you're not inside of it. I don't want you to feel like you're sitting in the middle of the orchestra, but that you're engulfed with the sound, that you have this immersive experience. So what that involves is having microphones that go there and having ambiances that go there and pulling things subtly off the screen so that, you know, there occasionally is a time when you want to use the effect of putting the guitars in the back, or some of these pop mixes that are coming up now using Atmos where, you know, they have, like on the Elton John mix, the strumming guitars are on the sides. That's not my particular taste. And it's not that I don't like it. It's just that I don't really, for orchestral music, feel that that is as effective as just really creating the space. So the Atmos is integrated into the sound. And where I use it as an effect, for example, on Lion King, we had this particular style of sound that was the signature sound of the baddie, Scar, the bad guy. And it was all these low woodwinds, bass clarinet, contrabass, contrabassoon. And what I did with that was I experimented with taking the spot mics, the close mics, and the overall mics and raising them up so that they're halfway between the screen and the ceiling. So thinking about the floor as one level and then being able to create a second level by just moving it up a little bit. And it was quite effective. I was surprised at how effective it was going to be. So that's sort of as of this moment, my sort of philosophy about it is just trying to make the theatrical releases feel kind of wide. I don't want you to realize you're listening in Atmos. I don't want you to go, oh, that Atmos was cool. If you notice the Atmos, then I feel like I didn't do my job. But if you notice that you just felt more viscerally involved in the music, that's really the effect I'm trying to get.
So you are not following any like strict rules, but you trying to experiment and to try some stuff which might be even new for you, right?
All the time. All the time.
Great.
I can tell you this much: on every movie I do, there's 2 or 3 things that I set up and do that I've never done before. And I always make sure that if they don't work, I'm covered. But it might be a microphone position, it might be a process, you know, a plug-in, just an approach or something like that. But I do it every single time because I feel like, oh, you know, people expect you nowadays with all the tools that we have at our disposal. They expect you to evolve. You know, if I was making stuff sound the same as I did when I did Gladiator, then I mean, all the Gladiator lovers would love it, but all the Chris Nolan people would be like, well, what are you doing? And, you know, now it's, you know, I just did Mulan with Harry Gregson Williams, and we went back to a more organic sound, but we did it in a new way. You know, we did it sort of giving it more expansiveness in the sound. So I'm just constantly experimenting.
Great.
I think that's one of the advantages of being insecure is I always feel like my work isn't good enough. So I always try to make it a little better.
Yeah, I know that feel. Thank you. I mean, I catch myself in a feeling that I want to make notes, but I cannot do it now.
Right.
But I will do it later. Thank you.
You know what would have been
Yeah.
great, and I wish I had done this years ago, and I have a couple of friends that have done this that are in the business, where over the course of their careers, they had a little notepad and they would write down these different ideas and positions and microphone choices and distances and stuff. Looking back, I wish I had done that because there would have been a lot of interesting information for me. You know, when my time mixing is over, I'd like to pass the baton to young mixers who can take over and do that. And it would be great to be able to pass that information on, you know?
Yes, I was just I just finished reading L. Schmidt's book.
Right.
He's
So Al,
really
that's a great example of that,
yeah
of
yeah yeah.
being able to do that is Al's book. Right.
Uh, Great. Let's move on. We have a question from Roman from St. Petersburg. I think
Is this
he
my
he went.
Roman?
Yeah, he went to your Mix with the Masters
Hello,
73.
Roman.
So his question is, you have a very cool way of using saturation. It's subtle but makes things better. Did you discover new saturation tools? What's your go-tos these days?
You know, recently my go-to has been, I've gone back to, I'll show it, I've just gone back to the PSP one, not the PSP one, the Fab Filter Saturator, which I love a lot, and I've been using quite a bit recently. The reason being is that you can make it run in high res so that the harmonic overtones don't filter back down. So in other words, even if I'm running at 48K or 44 run, I can run this at 2 or 3 times the sample rate so that the harmonics of the distortion don't filter back into the audio stream, which is really where you start getting that harshness. So I like this. And also the fact that you can separate the frequency ranges. So if I don't want to do anything to the low frequencies, I can process them. I can leave them unprocessed and then maybe process the mid frequencies a little warmer. And then if I want the, you know, where I want to put the aggressiveness and not. Other than that, I'm still a lover of the decapitator. The other thing I've recently done, which has been a lot of fun, and I have to move my computer to show you, was I actually bought an analog.
Sorry, could you please turn off screen share for a while? Because when you're sharing the screen, we see only the screen and
oh, okay. I'm
we
sorry.
cannot see
Oh,
what the
well, we don't
camera
want
sees.
that. Okay, so now that's off. How's that? Is that
for a
better?
while? Yeah, yeah. Now it works.
So one of the things I did recently was I bought an analog Dolby unit.
Wow.
And the reason I did that was, you know, I was playing with some of the Dolby plugins, and I found that it's a lot of fun to mix those on in. How do I turn myself off so I'm not looking at myself talk? That's the hardest part.
Oh, I'm not sure if you can or not. But you can right click on my picture. There are 3 dots and hit spotlight video or something, or pin video, so you will see me. It's not the best option still, but
it's not working like that. Isn't that funny? Well, it doesn't matter. I'll get used to it.
Chinese software.
So I was using the Dolby plugins, and then one of my clients, we experimented. We bought one of these Dolby units, and it just had such a unique sound. So what I do, and I know this isn't saturation, but it is sort of signal processing, is I pump it out through an analog output to the Dolby unit, record it back in, and then align the tracks. And it just adds a really great kind of harmonic distortion to the sound. So that's been something I've been doing a lot recently.
And which type of Dolby unit is
It's an
that part?
A301.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it cost me more to fix it than it did to buy it. I literally bought it for $700 and spent $1,000 recapping it and making it work.
Yeah, and it takes time. I have Dolby SP or SR here.
Right, Dolby SR, yeah. It was an effect that was done in the 70s when I was starting out, that people started using it on background vocals and drums, was processing stuff. They'd encode it with the Dolby and not decode it. So it would bring the top end up, or it would bring, it's actually a multi-band dynamic. So you can do it with any frequency range, and you can like sort of force, you know, the way it would work, its noise reduction was it would increase the high frequencies to get above the noise level and then drop the high frequencies. So now the noise level is dropping below the high frequencies. But if you don't decode the process, you get that enhanced top end. And we sort of are you know, 2020 ears sort of have gotten used to that enhanced top end, you know. So on the right thing, on the right sounds, it's actually a pretty cool sound.
Right. Yeah. We have a question from Ilya Mazaev, who is also an engineer. Could you tell anything about mixing new order technique? It's one of their best works and a milestone in electronic music. Ilya seems to be a fan of your
Well,
music.
thank you for asking that question. It's was an incredible project. I was fortunate enough, because I had done this Brian Ferry record called Bête Noire in 1985. And that, although it didn't sell very well, it was a really well-regarded record. The manager of New Order was contacted me, and I met with the band, and they hired me to do the record, and we went to Peter Gabriel's studio in Bath, and we went to Real World, and it was before the big room was built at Real World. So we were up in this little room called the Mill. And it was an incredibly interesting process. I learned a lot about mixing from mixing with them, you know, in a funny way. They knew more about mixing. Well, they certainly knew more about mixing New Order records than I did, you know, and so I had to like fit my style into their sound. And at that point, other than Brian Ferry, the thing I was doing the most was R&B records. So what my sound was really sort of an aggressive bass drum bass thing, you know, sort of that New York Bob Clearmountain kind of like approach to rock and pop and that, you know, I had done that on the Brian Ferry record, and that's what was popular. So I was doing that, and you know, I was quite young, and it was a lot of fun. They were all in the room all the time, and sometimes, you know, we stayed there. It's an estate, so there was, you know, a cook and everything like that. I was there with my soon-to-be ex-wife. So my ex-wife and I were fighting every night, and we would stay there. And sometimes I just would want to mix on my own. So I would, at 1 a.m, just wake up and go into I could come and go as I pleased. And I would just set up myself. I didn't care. It was all analog at the time. It was on an SSL console with, I don't even remember the speakers we had at that point. I do, but I can't put the name on it. And I tried to mix on my own, but Peter Hook, the bass player, Hooky, this minute he would like wake up in a second if he heard music. And it didn't matter if I started mixing at 3 a.m. or 1 a.m, within 10 minutes, he was in the room. And he just wanted to hang out and mix. You know, he just was like, he didn't even say anything. He would read a book, and he would circle words in the book that would give them ideas for song titles, you know? So every single song title was like Fine Time was something he had circled in a book, and Round was something he had circled in a book. And the name New Order actually, well, came from Joy Division. I don't know if you know the history of that, but the Joy Division was in World War II. The Nazis conscripted pretty Jewish girls to work as prostitutes for the Nazi officers, and they called them the Joy Division. So when the singer died, his name escapes me right now. I'm sure most of you know who I'm talking about. Ian. When he died, they knew they needed to change the name of the band, so they just took another Nazi expression, which was the New Order. You know, and that's how that came about. But you know, it was interesting. This is one of those examples where I thought that I would never ever work again, because I thought I had done this terrible job on mixing this record, and because of that record, all the members of the band, I went on to mix electronic for Bernard and Johnny Marr, and now Johnny is one of my dearest friends for 30 years, and with Peter Hook, he had 2 other bands, and I went on to mix all of Peter's records after that. Until I got into film. And once I got into film, I sort of lost contact with all that world. But you see, I still have this New Order poster on my wall. And
yeah.
it was a magical time in my life, because I was a young mixer, and I was just starting to do things that people heard other than in a dance club, you know, and, you know, because I had been doing dance records in New York for all of the big dance remixers at that time, Arthur Baker and Shep Pettibone and everything. But I was this completely anonymous, unknown mixer, you know, and then because of Brian Ferry, I started getting out there a little bit. And then, of course, the New Order thing really made a difference. And fortunately for me, Hans was a fan of both the Brian Ferry record and the New Order record. So when I met Hans and we had worked together a little bit, he came to me and says, you know, I really do love those records you did back in the 80s. And I'm like, how do you know those records? He's like, it was so funny. So there is a version of my past where it could be said that those records really helped me have the career I have today. I'm not sure it's the real version, but sometimes my mind takes me there.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
We're coming to more technical questions from live chat. Alexander Wisburn is asking, if do you use delays on mics or groups of instruments while mixing live orchestra, and what are the main concepts behind orchestral mixing for you?
Well, those are two very different questions. I do use delays. I don't resolve the entire room. I've tried resolving the entire room to a singular point, and I find that at least with my ear and my client's ears, because what I would do is I would resolve the rooms, and then I would duplicate the orchestra so that I could play back and forth and compare the resolved room to the unresolved room. And usually the comment was that the resolved room, although the sort of phase relationships were a little bit more solid, the depth went away quite a bit. So what I do is certainly when I record percussion separately, if it's any percussion that has a lot of transient detail, drum, snare drums or taikos or anything where there's a pretty sharp transient, I'll always resolve the close mics to the room, because I find that just makes a huge difference, in terms of how solid the drum sound and how the resolution of the low end and stuff like that. So I'll pick and nowadays it's so easy. I used to do it with a plugin, but I don't actually do that anymore. And I do it in a larger group. I don't go every mic resolved to its absolute point compared to the centered tree mic, which I used to do. Now what I do is I just take the group of close environment and I move it towards the tree, or vice versa. I move not the tree, the room, all of the room, the tree, the wides, the Atmos. So I treat them as basically two different, I'm sorry?
The whole bunch of tracks you just
right.
aligned.
So I treat it as basically two different worlds, the close world and the room world. And I resolve the two of them, and I end up getting a tremendous amount of power out of that. Now, in a full orchestral recording, when I'm doing everyone together, I still at times will take the percussion mics and resolve them into the room a little bit more, because especially with some percussion, I find, and like when I work at Abbey Road, it's such a big room that if I do need to use spot mics on, say, the snares and things like that, you can really hear how early those spot mics are compared to the rest of the room. So I'll delay those. Nowadays, usually I just move them. I don't delay them. I just move them, or I have my assistant move them. We just sort of set up how it works, and we do that. It depends on the project, but I find that makes a huge difference.
Thank you.
And then my orchestral approach really does change from project to project. It depends a lot on whether or not the plan for the particular project is to combine the samples with the live stuff, or if the plan is to get rid of the samples and just use the orchestra. It will determine how much of the spot mics I'm going to use compared to the room and stuff like that. And basically I'll adjust my miking to that. The only philosophy I have that is sort of a general philosophy is I'm constantly looking for ways to use less mics. I'm constantly looking for ways to avoid having the mics interrelate with each other too much, so that I end up with the combing effects and the phase discorrelations from having too many mics. So to that end, unless there's a specific need why I would need to have more, I'm only going to use 2 mics on the violins, front and back, violins, front and back. My spot miking is pretty minimal, and then I'll have a feature mic. If I know that there's going to be violin solos or stuff, there will be a closer mic for that. Same thing with the cello, or if I know that one of the voices in the orchestra, like for example, on Mulan, one of the voices was a contrabass clarinet, so I had a mic set up for that and all that. But my only philosophy is try to minimalize it, so that, and it makes for easier recordings, and it makes my rough mixes at the stage better rough mixes, because there's less to manage in that short period of time, and gives the composers and the directors a better idea of what it's going to sound like in the end.
Great. It seems like people are really interested in orchestral recording process.
Yeah. So am I. I wish I knew how to do it.
Next question is, please from Vladimir Moritz. Please ask Alan how often he used Decca tree in recording, and does he blend Decca mic placement with other stereo mic pairs like AB or TF, etc. in final mix. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I am a Decca tree user. I don't tend to blend in other stereo effects in the same plane. I find that it sometimes is satisfying in the short term, but in the long term, it kind of pollutes the imaging to me. And so I use stereo techniques on sectional stuff. So like you'll see an ORTF set up maybe on the brass that is then blended in to the picture as a closer environment, and use that as a way to avoid using the close mics, the spot mics. So I start from the room and I work my way down. If I can get enough presence by just using the room and my feature mics, you'll see a left, right, and it could be ORTF, it could be XY, it could be any one of those, or it could just be a general distance that I look at because I see 6 French horn players and I want to cover one group of 3 and one group of 3. It doesn't necessarily have to be any of the traditional numbers or distances. That's how I use that. I used to record a secondary bloom line with the orchestra, but I stopped doing that because I just found that unless I'm going to use it as an effect where I'm going to turn off the big room and use that, say if it's like a big band score or something like that, where I know that I'm not always going to want to have the image of a scoring stage, then I might do that. But for my generalized sound, I don't tend to do that very much. I just find that unless it's like sometimes I'll have an alternate stereo image up if I know that I'm going to be mixing this in stereo. If like I'm doing a TV show, where the main mix is going to be a stereo mix, I might put up a stereo pair, and that's what I go to. And then I have the Decca tree and the outriggers as sort of an alternative version to either if it's too sort of like undefined in stereo, I can go back to that stereo mix. But even at that, I don't really do that often anymore. I used to do that more. I'm a little bit more confident now that my main image is going to work for me. So I don't put up, again, going to the lesser mics scenario, I don't put up as many of those. What I always do try is some mics that are just completely ridiculous or unusual. Like on Lion King, I just bought this $40 15-inch woofer and wired it in reverse and put it up in front of the basses. I don't know.
And
It actually kind of
final mix.
Yeah, it made it in on certain cues, where I wanted to have more pressure from the basses. It didn't sound that great on its own, but what it did do is it added sort of an intensity to the sound when it was necessary. It wasn't in there all the time. It maybe made it onto 2 or 3 cues. It was a cool sound. The problem with doing stuff like that is you in the moment, it sounds cool because it's new and different. And then if you just leave it in all the time, after a while you go, oh my God, wait a minute, hold on. Am I sure that that's good? And then it's like, oh, it's not as good as I thought. Now you've already delivered. So I'm always trying to be very careful with stuff like that. I'll use it, but I always judge it. Like every single cue, I'll push it up and see if it's working. I go, nah, not this time. But for some of it, it worked. Yeah.
Great. And a question from me, actually, how often do you subtract the high frequencies from the string sections from violins and from the orchestral recording to make it deeper? And do you do it at all?
Yeah, I do quite a bit. And actually, there's so much more technology now to help you do that. There's a plugin by this company OEK Sound called Soothe, SOOTH. Now they have Soothe 2. And I find that now when I want to do that, when I want to get away from some of that presence that I get on the top end and that harshness to get it a little deeper in the room, that Soothe actually works better than a static EQ. But that's not saying I don't use static EQ. Sometimes I'll use a Pultec plugin and I'll use the attenuate, a little bit of the attenuate set at 5K, and I get it up to 2 or 3. So I'm just taking the top end edge off of it. I find that a lot with scoring stages, certainly with like 20th Century Fox, which is a pretty bright stage, and less often with Abbey Road, but that there are times where without doing any EQing on the top end, it's a little bit too bright for me, and not bright's not quite the right word. Harsh, present.
Harsh, yeah.
Present. It's like I can get more distance by bringing it down. So I use that Soothe plugin, which is a very elegant plugin now, especially that they've made it less DSP intensive. You can listen to just the artifacts that you're taking out, and I can really tune it to the stuff that my brain is telling. It's an interesting thing when you get a little older. Your hearing shifts a little bit, and you start responding to harshness differently. You start hearing harshness as a separate entity from the overall frequency response. And sometimes you have to make lemonade out of lemons. What would seem like a liability, sometimes I can use as an advantage. So sometimes with orchestral stuff, I hear the harshness as almost like a separate thing. So I can actually go in and find that harshness that I'm hearing, focus exactly on it, and then remove it or attenuate it. You don't really want to remove it.
Yeah.
So the Soothe works great for that. And then, also like using, talk about plugins that are, modern plugins that are doing really great stuff. The Sound Theory Gulfos, which is sort of the same process for upper bass and lower mid-range, although you could use it on high frequencies too. But I use it sort of for its original intention, to clean out some of that generalized mud that exists in a large room like that. Some of the resonances in the room and the resonances from the instruments. And if you just use it very, very subtly, and use it on the full mix, on the like the either if you're in 5.1, the 5 mix or the 7 mix, turns out that all of that stuff tends to be pretty omnidirectional. So by taking some of that out, you actually expand your imaging quite nicely, and you without doing any image work whatsoever, you end up with a much wider soundstage than you do just by removing some of the unnecessary resonances in the 200 to 500 range.
So is it correct to say that you are focusing on the soundstage while doing any adjustments to the sound?
Always. It's all about, to me, it's always about the soundstage.
Soundstage.
It's very rare once I'm started that I get into microphones. Once I got my image, the only time I get into microphones is when I'm doing something corrective, like I can't hear enough violas, so I need to push the violas and stuff like that, or there's an artistic reason that, or times like my client Henry loves to be able to really do this soaring violin sound, and we've discovered the way to do it is to have a reverb sending just from the violin spot mics in pre, so that I can ride the send into those and then have this beautiful reverb respond to that. So that's something I manipulate. But once I passed my initial stages of doing a mix, I call it my macro mix. So I go from the large stuff to the small stuff. So I start with getting my orchestral balances, on whatever orchestral passes I have. If it's a one orchestral recording, like on the Star Wars stuff or Captain Marvel, where it was just a live recording with everyone in the room, or if it's a real production score, which could have 10 to 12 passes of orchestra, I get those sounds and then I think of them as one thing, which is why Pro Tools 2020 is great, because it has folders.
Folders.
And I'm all about folders right now.
And excuse me.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
And how often these days you got the full live performances for modern productions, for modern movies?
More now than in the past few years, to be quite honest with you. I think part of that is I'm doing a lot more Marvel movies, so Marvel, that's the policy, they want to record it in the room. So when I did Captain Marvel, when I did Thor, everything was done in the room. The decision was made, I don't know, I did this video game last year, Star Wars Fallen Angel, very popular video game. We did 6.5 hours, Fallen Order, I'm sorry. we did 6.5 hours of music at Abbey Road, 3 weeks at Abbey Road. That was the best 3 weeks of my life. What's that?
Incredible.
Incredible, totally incredible. And, you know, now with this coronavirus, I don't know the next time I'll be able to get to Abbey Road. I was supposed to be there in July doing a movie with Mark Mothersbaugh, but I doubt that's going to happen now.
I was supposed to be there July 2.
Yeah. So on that, we did everything. I delivered one stem to the stage, literally in the final mix. They didn't, we even did choir separately. And I was like, do you want a choir stem? They were like, no, we just want your mix. We don't want anyone to touch it. So we did everything together, percussion, everything together in the room at the same time. And harp, piano, percussion, strings, brass, live guitars live in the room, and absolutely everything.
I mean, in the same room as the orchestra.
Yeah, everything. All in Studio One at Abbey Road, you know.
And how different is no, excuse me. Does your approach differ when you mix for the game, or when you mix the movie score?
Yeah, very much so. Depending on the game, most of the games, at least up until the last year or so, I've had to deliver in quad. So, you know, there's no center channel, there's no LFE, and you kind of get good at doing it in quad. But on Fallen Order, what we did was we actually put up quite a few immersive arrays. We were experimenting. We did this Ambio Cube, and we used this Core Audio third order ambisonic microphone and stuff like that, and this ESMA array. And we experimented mixing it 2 different ways. I mixed it through an ambisonic matrix in true ambisonics, and we discovered that didn't work because A, I don't know, there was something not quite as satisfying about it, but more importantly, B, the mix down to stereo from that world just didn't sound as good.
Mm-hmm.
And then we did a traditional 7.1 mix. They wanted that game at 7.1. They had allocated enough DSP in the gameplay to be able to handle a 7.1. Now, originally it was going to be an Atmos, but some point down the line, the you know, deciders, the producers decided that there wasn't enough reason to do Atmos. So, but the interesting thing about that was all the immersive techniques that I had recorded, or 2 of the immersive techniques I recorded, sounded fantastic when I combined them into 7.1 with the other miking. It became my ambience mics. So the high ambience mics that I usually recorded at Abbey Road, I ended up not using, and I used these arrays as my ambience, and it sounded fantastic. So so the video game world changes a lot. I think that as processing gets easier, cheaper, and more powerful, they are going to start including more stuff. You know, now there's 3D audio, and, you know, they have this NX stuff on waves that has. So I know that that's coming down the road. I've actually been involved with Abbey Road with Merrick Stiles, who's their guy who handles that stuff, in beta testing some of that material.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, we'll see what happens next. Whatever my next video game is, I don't have one on the books right now. So whatever the next one is, we'll see what they want. But it changes. I mean, it used to be that you had to deliver everything in stereo, and that when you asked them if you could do quad, they said, no, there's no way we could give you the resources to do that. And now I'm doing stuff in 7.1. So
thank you.
I don't know if that answered the question or not.
I think, anyways, it's interesting for all of us. So there is another question here regarding the recording process. Alan, what is your opinion about coloring sounds during recording session by picking different preamps, or you prefer to capture sound as clean as possible?
No, I'm a big fan of coloring sounds. You know, there are people out there who are more preamp junkies than I am. You know, I have quite a collection of nice preamps, but I'm pretty you know, utilitarian about the way I use them. All of my spot miking and stuff, I use the Grace preamps for, and the very simple reason is that I have 48 channels of them, and they're controlled with a remote control. and it's very clean, and it just makes my life a lot easier. I don't have to jump up. My Decatree stuff, I actually had for 20 years this proprietary preamp made by this guy, Fred Forcell, who actually designs the preamps for AEA and had designed the preamps for a lot of people, for Avid for a while. And he had benched a couple of preamps that he was using to design the Millennia 2 preamp. And he sent them to me to just give him my thoughts on it, and I loved them. So I said, can I buy the prototypes? So I did, and I bought all three of the prototypes. And for 20 years, they were my main microphones on my main preamps on my mics. And then during Lion King, they died. So I sent it to him to fix, and he goes, look, I'm going to be honest with you. This is 20-year-old technology. I have a much better preamp now based on the same topology. I'm happy to send it to you to try. And, you know, it cost me a fortune to fix this. So he sent me his newest version of his preamp, and it was great. So that's what I'm using. But I have 8 channels of the new Manley Force because I think that they have a tremendous amount of headroom, and I can get really kind of snappy drums out of them. And I have a rack of Neves. And when I work at Sony, my absolute favorite preamp in the world is this Boulder preamp, which has these Jensen transformers in it. And that is my favorite preamp in the world, but you can't find them anywhere. So the only time I get to use them is they have 12 of them at Sony, and I put them on brass and percussion. But that's it. You know, it's I'm not like out there. Oh, no, it's not it. So I also have some of the little 2-unit AEA TRP preamps. And when I use my ribbon mics, when I use my Coles ribbons, I have 6 Coles ribbon mics.
And how do you use these Coles ribbons usually?
I use them on low brass. You know, I use them on low brass, and I love that sound. I, you know, discovered that sound at Abbey Road because they have so many of them. And then I always was unsatisfied in LA. I'm like, you know, they're the right sound for most things. And so I ended up buying 6 of them, as I tend to do at times. And then so I use those AEA TRPs on those because that short cable run, you know, having them out there next to the mic really does make a difference to me. So, and that's it. You know, I don't have a gazillion different choices, and, you know, but I mean, I have a pretty good, I probably have 50, 60 preamps. So,
yeah, but that's the answer, definitely. And would you mind showing us a little bit of your session layout and how is it organized and laid out?
Well, this is a record I'm doing with Moby. So this is not, I can open up an orchestra. Well, I'm at home, so I don't actually have any orchestral sessions, but basically, well, in this particular version of the world, it's probably not a great example because I just discovered folders. So everything is in folders. So my whole layout literally is I've been experimenting with. So these are all of my orchestral passes. And if I was to unwind it, basically it was my microphones going to, you know, an auxiliary, and I have my balance in there. In this case, I'm not that far along on this mix. I have my processing on the aux, and then, well, this is not a good example. So I think I'm better just to talk about it.
Sure.
You know, my film layout, if that's what you're interested in, my orchestral layout, is a pretty standardized layout so that I can go from one project to the next really quickly. And basically, it's each pass goes into its auxiliary, and I do my processing on the orchestra on those individual auxiliaries so that my short strings could have a different EQ than my long strings. And then the thing that I think is unique to the way I like to work is I send the reverb as a unit from the orchestra and not from the individual microphones. So I have one reverb send on the orchestra and on the auxiliary, and then that send goes to 3 different auxes as an input, and those 3 auxes go to 3 different reverbs. So on my template layout on my console, my S6, when I go to my orchestral layout, I have my master fader, and then next to it, I have the 3 faders controlling my 3 reverbs that I have. So I can, if I want it to be, if it's a cue or a sound that wants a shorter reverb, I can just sort of automate that. And that I spend a tremendous amount of time automating my ambiances. So do I need a sort of a mid-distance hall? Do I need a shorter sort of chamber sound? Do I need a long tail to tail something out because it sounds dry in the end? And I do that for each pass. So for each string pass, for each any orchestral pass, brass, percussion, everything that is that architecture. It goes, the microphones go to an aux, the aux gets processed, that process sound goes to a reverb send, and that reverb send goes to 3 different reverbs. And then I play with it in my automation. Then all of that stuff goes to a master stem aux section, so that if I'm delivering, say, 10 stems, maybe it's strings, brass, high perk, low perk, solos, synth, guitars, whatever, else 1, else 2. Each of those has a master fader, and that's where I do whatever little bit of mastering that I do. So I'll have my limiter on there, which is usually, I use quite a bit, it's the quartet, it's the whole grain quartet. It's a fantastic limiter, and it has a little bit of dynamic EQ in there. I could show you that.
Yeah, could you please show this?
Yes, of course. I'll show you that unit. So in this case, on this session, even though this is a record mix, I do have my aux section, although in this case I haven't actually built it yet. But so this would be what my aux session would look like, and then every one of these faders would get hold on. Probably a good idea to do this now anyway, because I have to mix this later. We get this plugin.
Oh.
And the reason I use that one is it's very, very DSP smart. So it works with you in terms of that. And then it's beautifully flexible. So my neutral setting, I have my high frequencies, then I have a peak, another peak, and my low frequencies. And if I want to do a little generalized EQ, my low frequencies, I'm sorry, that should be there. Generalized EQ, I could do a little bit of a smile curve like that. If it's this smile curve translate to Russian?
Yeah, it's a international term.
Right, and then I can have dynamic, I can have compression, so that in the frequency range where my that mud is, the 200 range, I can have a little bit of if I put this on dynamic. So if I put that on, say, the drums here, I know you're not going to be able to hear it, but you'll be able to see it do its thing. And I blow this up to there, you can see. So and then I could
like slightly demodern.
Yeah, and I could just manage these frequency ranges a little bit. And then if I want, if it's a thing that like is a thing that goes from really soft to really loud, and so I get a good sound in the soft, and then when it gets loud, it gets a little nasty sounding. I can even put a little bit of dynamic EQ on the overall high frequency range. So, I mean, this is a fantastic plugin because, like, for vocals, you can use it for vocals where you can have a de-esser and the high frequencies interact and be very clean. And then usually I work at very little gain, but sometimes if I know I have a very dynamic cue, I'll add maybe 4 dB of gain to it when I start, so that I can have my source, my faders, my microphones a little bit lower, so that I have more dynamic range to work with. So it's a very, very flexible thing. I'll put a tiny bit of limiting on it. And then, it's such a deep plugin. I'm not good with deep plugins per se. So So I get a little crazy when the technology takes my brain away from the creativity. And so I just use it, that's sort of my standard setup for that. And then on those stems too, if it's a, you know, a cue or a movie that is a more aggressive sound, I can put whatever processing I want on that. Maybe it's an inflator, maybe it's an EQ, you know, another EQ, or some compression on the percussion, or some transient design on the overall percussion, which is, you know, if I want to do a little bit of transient design on the overall, say my ethnic percussion, I want to have it have a little bit more attack. I could use like the Sonics Evolution or something on the bus. So that's a place I can do all that stuff. And then that either gets recorded onto tracks or it gets committed as stems, depending on how, you know, if I'm home, I don't have 2 rigs and I'm limited in terms of my horsepower. So I just commit my stems, and at work, I print them separately.
And is it possible for you to mix the whole score at your home setup?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We're doing that now. I'm mixing 2 movies at home. Well, I was doing it this week, but they just got, because of the whole debacle with this coronavirus and we couldn't record orchestra, they've pushed it to June. So I'm actually very frustrated at the moment, which is good for you guys because it gives me a chance to talk to you. They're bad for me, but it'll come back. So, but yeah, I can mix. I have HDX3 set up here, and I'm actually, believe it or not, running on a Mac Mini at home, and I haven't had any problems with it yet. My studio, you know, I just put a Mac Pro, the new Mac Pro, in my studio in Santa Monica, but at home I have a Mac Mini.
It's quite unbelievable.
It's fantastic.
Next question.
Yeah.
Oh, have you finished your answer?
Yeah.
Great. Alan, thanks for sharing knowledge and your ideas with us. Could you please tell briefly about the main issues with translating mixes from mixing room to theaters and TV and other portable devices like laptops, smartphones, and so on? Thank you.
That's a tough one. It's a big question. Well, through the years, the thing with translating it into the theater, obviously, is the difference in low end and trying to manage that. I'm fortunate enough that I have a good relationship with almost every dubbing stage and dubbing mixer. So what I tend to do, or what I've tended to do in the past, is once I have some mixes I'm happy with, I go to the stage and I listen to it there so that I can calibrate sort of, because every dubbing stage is different. You would hope that there was a standard so that they all sounded the same, but I don't know if it's the same in Russia, but every single dubbing stage sounds, bright stages, there are live stages, there are boomy stages, there are stages where the surrounds are louder and quieter. So I find that what I do is that I bring it, and then I can make some decisions about how loud my subwoofer is, my LFE is. Am I hearing my surrounds? Do I need to? And I'll adjust the levels in my room to try to make it so that what I deliver fits into their room better. And now, through the years, I've sort of tuned that to the point where I know what most of the rooms are going to do. And now I know what most of the dubbing mixers. So if I'm working with Paul Massey, I set it up one way. And if I'm working with, one of the other guys, I can't think of anyone's name, Dave Fleur, I give him a different type of sound and stuff like that. In terms of portable devices and stuff like that, I'm still working it out. It's still a work in progress. It's still, I listen, the final answer to that is I just print the mix and I listen to it on my phone. I listen to it on headphones. I listen to it on my TV at home, and I tweak it until, the good news is if I'm doing a film, I can sort of tweak a stereo, but that's not the stereo that's going to end up in the movie anyway. That sort of comes down from the dub, and they now, all the main movies that, you do, they have a post-production process where they're doing their down mix to alternate media. But if it's just me mixing a record, I'm going to mix it so that it sounds good on big speakers. But then the most important thing now, and I learned this really from my friends who are like world-class worker mixers, Manny Marican and Tony Maserati, and those guys who I respect tremendously and I've become good friends with, is the thing that they focus on by far more than how it sounds on a large set of speakers is how it sounds on headphones and earbuds and on their iPhones, you know. So yeah, I don't have a secret formula for that, to be honest with you.
No, no one has a secret formula, but it's really inspiring to hear hear from you that you are working on it and you're trying different approaches. It's really really inspiring.
I'm trying to get my standards for all the different formats together. There's actually a new meter plugin that came out that literally gives you your level compared to all of the standards, to Spotify, to iTunes, to you know, all of the different standards, YouTube and everything, and it shows you 1 dB lower there, and I'm not crazy enough, and I don't know, I'm curious to know if anyone does this. Do people build like 7 mix outs from the same input to adjust for all these levels, or do they let, you know, when they deliver the mix to Spotify, do they let them normalize it to their level? It'd be an interesting question, because there's like 7 or 8 formats that need to be serviced now.
Yeah.
Anyway.
An interesting question here from Alexander Senikov. How often, if ever, do you finish your mixes with a background feeling that the work could be done still even better?
100% of the time.
Yeah, the mix can be finished, it can be stopped, right?
There's very, very few mixes I listen to. There was one cue on Lion King that I said, you know what? That's a good mix. That's a pretty good mix.
And do you remember which one?
I do, but unfortunately in the movie, it didn't translate well. I'm trying to think of how to say this. Unfortunately, music did not take the amount of importance that I had hoped it would, and that I think
I understand what you mean.
Yeah, so I'd rather not say which cue it was, just for that reason. But there was cue early on in the movie that I felt like that's a pretty good mix. You know, other than that, I'm happy with my mixes. Don't get me wrong. I'm never not happy with my mixes. I go through this process. My mixing, I'll tell you the honest truth. The way I fortunately do things now is I always ask for some time on my own, and I mix very quickly. I get through the mixes as quickly as I can so that I have another chance to listen to them before I play them back for the composer. And that second listen sort of indicates to me where I'm really at. You know, because I always feel like that first thing, I'm a little too technical. I'm thinking about a lot of stuff and I'm not as musical. So I try to get through 90% of the process. And then the last 10%, I go back and listen to, and I will never play a composer a mix until I've had that moment to sit with it and massage it. And that's where kind of all the subtle automation happens. That's like where all the depth, I work on the depth and getting all the balances and the feel and all that. And at that point, I'll play it for the composer and I'll get their feedback. And then, so I have that third pass at it. And by then, usually, you know, on a project that's a good project, I'm pretty happy. There are projects I'm never going to be happy on. There are times where you're never going to be happy. I mean, because you being happy or me being happy with the sound goes against what the director is looking for. It goes, you know, there's just the common ground isn't there. Now, I still know how to get them what they want, but it's not really what I think is the most musical thing. And you know, our job as engineers is not to satisfy us. You know, if I was worried about satisfying myself, I would be driving an Uber now, you know, because that your job is, you're a service person. Your job is to make the person sitting next to you like realize their vision, you know. That's why Al Schmidt says, that's why their name is on the front of the record and your name is on the back of the record. And I take that very, very seriously. So there's many, many projects that I have done where at the end of the day, I wish I had an opportunity to mix it in a different way, and I didn't get it because that's not what they were looking for.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you have any advice? It's a question from me, actually. Do you have any advice for young engineers to train their ears and, most important, to train their taste? And how do you?
Well, I don't know if you can train taste. I think that taste is taste. You know, it's like It's a completely subjective thing. I know that there were records that I listened to when I was young that I can always go back to. And for me, there was the Steely Dan records, the Asia in particular, Gaucho, which is a little bit different for me because I actually assisted on that record. So I think about that. And then records that don't necessarily sound good, but feel good. All the early Stevie Wonder records, Songs in the Key of Life and stuff like that. And then all the, some of the, I was a big lover of jazz fusion. So the Chick Corea records, the Return to Forever records, for me, My Spanish Heart. And then some of the classical stuff that I loved when I was younger, some of the different recordings that I used as a point of reference. I can always go back to those and listen and get sort of my brain back in order. I need to recalibrate every now and then. The interesting thing is that some of the records that I loved early on, the low end is so different now. There's so much more low end in records now than there was back in those days that you can't really calibrate the frequency range. You just have to calibrate the feel. And then there are certain people that work today whose mixes I just love. For example, Richard King, who is just, in my opinion, one of the great mixers of all time, engineers, and he does all the Yo-Yo Ma records. And so like the Goat Rodeo sessions, for me, I remind myself what organic music sounds like, and if my stuff sounds more processed or louder or not as loud or not as full. And Richard's a guy that's not above using processing. So he's not one of these purist orchestral engineers. He's, and then, my colleague and competitor, Sean Murphy, some of the stuff he's done, the Shostakovich recordings he did with Boston Symphony in 2017 and 18, I use those as points of reference. Although for those, I feel like those are processed sounding. I do feel like those are a scoring mixer doing classical records. So I have a different ear that likes to listen to those. I can tell you one thing for sure. I can't listen to anything I've ever done as a point of reference. It just doesn't work for me, So I have those points of reference. And as far as my taste, I just, there are records that come out that I just love. And through the years to this day, I can tell you that I've listened to My Spanish Heart probably once a month for the last 40 years. So I think I have this belief that the records that influenced you when you were young, you never replace. So that's why it's hard for artists like Elton John to come out with new music, because everyone wants to hear what they got laid to the first time or what they got drunk to the first time. They don't care about his new stuff. And so then they get frustrated and they start writing stuff that doesn't sound as good because they're trying to appeal to the new popular sound and all that. Early Sting records and Police records, all that stuff, just that's the stuff that's close to me. So I always go back to the source. It's really like going back to the source, and it never lets me down.
Thank you. I mean, I really feel happy, and I'm sure that people in that stream also feel happy for hearing that from you. Thank you. It's just thanks.
No problem.
We have like a few more questions for us.
Yeah,
Not to stay
I'm in
here
no rush.
long.
There's nothing to do. I'm in no rush.
I mean, actually, there are lots of questions, but I don't want to take a lot of your time, and I know how
We're fine. I'm good for a while. I'm mixing this, but honestly, there's no deadline. I'm just mixing this because my movie got pushed. So a week ago, I thought I was going to be incredibly busy all the time, and now that's completely changed.
Yeah.
So
same everywhere.
Like my little room here. This is my mixing room at home.
So we got ATCs.
I have ATCs. Yeah, it was funny. I got lucky. I didn't have ATCs in here. I just had a stereo pair of JBL LSR8s. And then about a month ago, I brought something I had done from work home, and I listened to them on the JBLs, and I'm like, I just don't really like these JBLs. It's not that they're bad speakers. I didn't have the room tuned and anything like that. So I called up ATC. I have a very good relationship with ATC because not only do I have my studio, but I've, 5 or 6 of my clients have bought full ATC systems based on me. So they take good care of me. And I said to the guy who runs the company in America, I said, figure out a way to get me a good price on a pair of 50s, because I knew that was going to be the biggest I could have at home. So they worked out a way to be able to sell me a pair of 50s for a really good price, and I bought them. So then I was in stereo, and then one of my Japanese clients had this TV show, and he asked me to mix it in surround. And usually whenever that happened, I had to go back to my studio in Santa Monica, and there's financial considerations there. I have to pay the staff, the studio, and all that. So I thought, well, what if I took the money from this project and turned my home studio into surround? And I did that. And literally, just as I finished doing that, this whole thing started. So now the good news is I have a surround studio at home that I can mix for during times where I can't go to work.
And I can see there is an Oratone behind you.
Yep.
Do you use some kind of mono control or?
So I have on my SPL, I just have it on the stereo output. So I just unmute the surround monitors, and I mute the surround monitors, and I unmute the stereo monitors, and it goes to the Oratone.
How often do you care about like mono compatibility and using
I've actually been more concerned about mono compatibility recently because of iPhones, because even though they are stereo, so to speak, the imaging is the mono imaging, I feel, is more important now than ever. Look, on films, it's tough. You're creating width and depth using time, and that's always going to be a compromise in mono. But on pop records, you can be a little bit more solid about your mono imaging. It's I find it very difficult to take a score that I like the sound of in a theatrical environment and squeezing it down to mono. Stereo, no problem. I can do that all day long, but mono is tough.
Yeah. Is there a piece of analog gear you're missing?
Yeah, I mean, I miss, I used to have 6 Manley massive passives. And the reason I had 6 was I thought that I could do 2 stems, 2 5.1 stems with 6 Manleys, each being stereo, 12 channels.
Yeah.
And now my mixes just got so big that it didn't make any sense anymore to tie up all the IO necessary to do that. So I've gotten rid of that. And then my stereo mix down chain, I miss. But what I am going to do actually is in my home room, this room, once this debacle is over, I've already had a desk built with racks on both sides. So the rack on the left is going to have that Dolby unit, and the rack on the right, I'm going to bring home my analog stereo mix chain, and I'm going to be able to use that at home. So I do miss that. I miss some of my old gear. I love this world. I think that, nowadays with technology being what it is and processing speed being what it is and CPUs getting bigger and bigger, that they're building better and better plugins. And I find that there are things I can do in the digital domain that are way more interesting to me than some of the stuff I was, I always felt, and a lot of guys, who started in the analog world, whenever we had to do something, there was a compromise. Well, we need another delay on this vocal. Well, I'm out of delays. What do? We got to sort of invent it. And, let's run a tape deck and record it back in. I don't have another track. Okay, well, it bounces. You spend all this time trying to figure that out, and not having that limitation is a mixed blessing, but at times it's a great blessing. But what I've actually been recently doing in my mixes is going back to using much less processing, so that I'm forced to mix music and then I add the plugins and stuff after that. But I'm sort of enjoying this period of time where I feel like we've had a huge uptick with the new Mac computers and with some of these new plugins that are using sort of not really intelligent plugins, but they feel intelligent because all this new stuff that it's been really fun and interesting to develop. George Massenberg, George and I are old friends, and he just did a seminar the other day, and we reconnected with that. He sent me his new plug-in
Equalizer.
compressor. Well, I got that too, but he sent me the compressor that's still in beta. And I'll tell you, that guy that's some compressor, but I got to remember how to use stuff that, is that forget about presets. He's not sending you any presets. You just got to use your ears and figure out how to make that shit sound good. And George is, he has this, George for some reason thinks I know what I'm doing. I don't want to like cue him in on the fact that I'm just I'm faking it, for 43 years. And somehow that's working because George really knows what he's doing. So that's what I'm actually doing today, is playing with that compressor to figure out how to really tweak it and get it right, So there's all this good stuff. I mean, yeah, I miss some of the analog stuff, but and even with the old, I had a lot of vintage microphones. I pretty much sold all my vintage microphones because there's so many great microphones being made today,
And which ones, for example?
Well, I mean, I love the Fleas versions of, all
vintage
the
classics, yeah.
47s, the C12. The problem with all of my old vintage mics was they got noisy and they were constantly needed maintenance all the time. And, I had these two KM54s that I loved the sound of when they worked, but they would, you'd have them on a session, I'd have them on piano, and all of a sudden one of them would start like cracking out. And, I had like a million tubes for my C12s and all that. And when I have 100 people in the room, I can't take that risk. So I love all those. I really love the new Mojave MA1000s. They're fantastic mics. And I'm sure all of you know I'm a big Royer fan. I love my Royer mics. But then I still love some of the old, I love my Coles mics. What else have I gotten recently? Audio Technica is making some fantastic microphones now. I love those. And then, there's some of the non-tube mics, I have 9 Sheps mics and I have like 9 DPAs. Some of them are older B&Ks, but, I have a lot of microphones. So it's hard to keep track, but I don't really use the vintage mics anymore. It's just too risky. Sean Murphy he's a little older than I am, and he was able to get into, and Dennis Sands, they were able to get into the vintage mics earlier on when they were not quite as expensive as they are now, and then get them repaired by Klaus Heine, who's this genius in America, this German guy who does repairs on all that. So interestingly enough, I bought 2 of the new U67s that Neumann put out, and I was slightly disappointed in them. I felt like they weren't quite as rich as I thought, as I remembered U67s. And then I looked at a blog post that Klaus said about the tensioning of the cabinet. So I called him, or I emailed him, and I said, "Can you help?" And he's like, "Yeah, send me your capsules and $1,000." So I did, and he sent them back, and they're way better now, way better. I mean, no comparison. So
yeah, Klaus says that they are now getting rid of that problem, and that newer 67 reissues are getting better than the runs.
So he took my 2, which were early on in the reissue, and did what he had to do to them. So has he been posting about that? I haven't really followed it. Has he been posting about on Gear Sluts, posting about that recently?
I don't quite recall. Maybe on some REP forums or Gear Sluts, something like that.
I'm gonna look that up. Yeah, so he did mine and I loved it.
And nice question here. What's the best way for you to have a rest from the studio job? Do you listen to music in your free time?
I listen to some music. I listen to music in the morning. I listen to quite a bit of classical music in the morning. I have a 19-year-old son who's home from school now, of course. And so he turns me on to a lot of this cool hip hop he likes. And I actually like quite a bit of that because it's sort of like going back to the old, Bob Dylan was a poet who put it to music, and on the better hip hop, that's sort of what that is. Mac Miller and some of this stuff. I like that. But to relax, I travel. I like that. And I used to play a bit of golf, but I haven't had time to do that. And I play with my dog. I don't know. I don't really have it. When I'm in it, I don't have as much free time as I'd like. And I'm sure I will, but not yet. But, doing the mix with the masters thing is really great for me. And we go, my girlfriend and I go and do that for a week. And then we go somewhere else. We travel to Paris or to Barcelona, and we do that and stay in a nice hotel and all that. But, it's a work in progress. What I do with my free time. I miss. It used to be golf, and then I realized that I wasn't really getting out of golf what I was hoping to get out of it, because I would just get frustrated at not being as good as I wanted to be. So I'm also not above watching a little TV, to be honest with you. Getting a good show and binging on it. I'm quite happy doing that for a couple of hours a night.
As we all do. Back to the technical side.
Yeah.
What's your approach to solo grand piano recording?
It depends on if it's orchestral grand piano or if it's a pop grand piano. They're two completely different.
I think the question is about the orchestral.
Right. So my approach is I usually have two sets of mics. I have one set of mic at the lid, and then one set of mics about 6 feet back. And the mic set about 6 feet back. Believe it or not, I've settled on a pair of Sennheiser MKH 800s. They've just worked for me time and time again. And if I can get away with that being the sound, if it's not a live performance where I'm overdubbing the piano, then I can get away with that being the sound. If it is a live performance, there are times where there's too much leakage for that to be the sound, and I go to the closer mics. And those mics can be anything. I actually like M49s for those. And I have them positioned in a way where it's like the front is looking at the hammers, but on the lid line, and the back is looking at the bass strings. And I don't pan them full left and right. I pan them at about 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. And I like that sound quite a bit. Now, obviously for pop stuff, you want to be closer in. So it's usually a 3 mic technique where I have 2 mics on the hammers and then 1 mic on the bass strings.
Thank you. And how often do you tend to make some elements in the mix more narrow? Do you use making something narrow for making the whole mix like wider, or you usually tend to try to create the wider space?
No. I think that if you're in an orchestral environment, you need to be able to use all the space available to you. The good news is in surround, because of the ambience, you have 360 degrees of ambience. You have so much more, even in the left and right portion of the imaging, the left, center, right, because you're not trying to squeeze all of the ambience in that same area. You have more room to move things around. So I can really get, a little more creative with my woodwind miking and stuff like that, my celli and where I have them sit. I don't try to recreate reality. I'm not like looking at the image and putting them where I see them. I used to try to do that. Everything is a little bit wider than it would be in the real world. But it is definitely, there are things shading. And for example, the piano in an orchestral environment, I don't really care for the sound of the high notes here and the low notes there. So I pan it in. The same thing with the drum kit. In a pop record, it's fun when the toms go across the image. But if you were to do that in something where, like even on a big band record, it sounds a little weird, because it just it sort of takes away the illusion of reality. If your drummer sounds as wide as your saxophones and your trombones. So you have to play with that imaging a little bit. Al Schmidt's a genius at that.
Yeah.
He shaped things like like a fraction, and he creates so much depth by doing that. It always blows my mind when I listen to his records.
Yeah, he's really inspirational.
Yeah, for me too, by the way. There's no, it's not, I'm as much of a fan of him, and he's a very good friend of mine. And I still, you know, every now and then I go sit in on a session with him, and it just sort of like going, oh, right, that's what I'm supposed to be doing.
It's an amazing opportunity, of course.
There was one project where where the film company asked me to remix some of the stuff he had done, and that was so hard. You know, that was so hard for me to do because I worshipped it, but they just felt like there was so much music that was more modern sounding, and Al's stuff sounded a little bit too of the period. It was big band stuff, and they wanted it to have a little bit more aggressive, modern sound. So I had done the movie, and these songs were in the movie, and so they asked me to do mixes in stereo. But it was like I never told Al. You know, he doesn't give a shit. He's got 24 Grammys, and he doesn't care if I remix 3 of his songs. But I don't know. I never wanted to tell him.
Okay, we won't tell him.
Yeah. It's his birthday.
Today?
I don't know if it's today, but it's this week. 89. Unbelievable. You know what he says about mixing now? His great line is, he's like, yeah, I try to do the Al voice, but I can't. He's like, yeah, I get my sound right, and I put the tambourine where I like it, and then Steve turns it down 12 dB, and it's perfect.
Yeah. Well, Alan, thank you. I think that we had like 90 minutes now, and I don't want to take your time anymore. Seriously, you are really kind, and we are more than happy having you here. I will now shut down the translation, the streaming. I mean, and we'll say like a couple more words to you. Let's say goodbye to the crowd.
Everyone, thanks for sitting in. I appreciate it. It's an honor for me to that you consider the things I have to say of any value. So, and I don't take that lightly. I'm very serious about that. And the most important thing is stay safe, stay home. Let's get through this craziness and get on with our lives so that one of these days I can sit with you in a room in Moscow and do this as opposed to on a computer.
Would be happy to, and I'm sure we will.
One day.
I'm shutting down the streaming now. Goodbye, guys. Thank you.